Thanks also to Finuala, for whom I'm clearly the thorn between the roses. As you saw yesterday, and we'll see again on Thursday, they are both hard acts to follow. Right, now my pleasant task is to recommend to you 10 excellent books in the categories of travel and exploration. Fair enough, but how do you define excellence? As Kate said yesterday, excellence, like beauty, is in the mind of the beholder, a matter of opinion. So just in case you want a more objective measure of quality, I have included for many of the books their Goodreads score, and I have regarded anything from a score of 3.8 upwards as very good or excellent. Little known is equally difficult, but be that as it may, let us go ahead. So the first book I've chosen is a book called Blue Latitudes, Going Boldly Where Captain Cook Has Gone Before. And it's written by an American historian and journalist by the name of Tony Horwitz. Sadly, he died only 2 years ago at a young age of 60. He was a past president of the Society of American Historians. And last year, they established in his memory the Tony Horwitz Prize, honoring distinguished works in American history. This is a charming book, and I expect you will enjoy it greatly. When Tony was 13, his parents bought him a small wooden sailboat, which he called Wet Dream. That tells you something about the light-hearted tone of his book. As a result, he developed a love for the sea and an interest in the life of Captain James Cook. So roughly 230 years after Cook, Tony Horwitz traveled the world, visiting places where Cook had been and comparing them as they are today with the way they were in Cook's time. My own interest in Cook began when I dropped out of medical school to sail to Sydney in this old ship for the 200th anniversary celebrations marking the arrival of Cook in Australia in 1770. Some people claim that this big gap accounts for large gaps in my knowledge. Later on, I had the opportunity to sail, as Tony Horwitz also did, on board a replica of Cook's ship Endeavour. So Cook made 3 famous voyages. The first was to observe a transit of Venus across the sun, and then after that he was to search for Terra Australis Incognita, the southern continent which some people thought must exist to balance the northern land masses. The second voyage was also to search for Terra Australis Incognita and involved a circumnavigation of Antarctica, and the third voyage, during which Cook died, was a search for the Northwest Passage. Now Cook's shadow still falls on the places which he visited. His voyages all had unintended and lasting consequences, and they led directly or indirectly to what Alan Moorhead perceptively called the fatal impact. His voyages had a fatal impact in Polynesia, in New Zealand, and in Australia. Through much of Australia's modern history, Cook was a hero of empire. His rediscovery of the eastern coast of Australia is still widely regarded as the founding moment of modern Australia. But more recently, his legacy has been clouded by evidence of the violence perpetrated on Indigenous peoples during the voyages, and more importantly, by the process of colonization which followed. But is that completely fair? After all, the first fleet only arrived in Sydney 18 years after Cook's first landing and 9 years after he died. Today, the 26th of January, just happens to be Australia Day, and it marks not Cook's rediscovery of Australia, but the arrival of the first fleet in Sydney Cove on the 26th of January 1788, 233 years ago today. But Australia Day 2021 is as likely to be marked by protests as by celebrations, And January the 26th is as likely to be called Invasion Day as Australia Day.
Joe, sorry, your microphone has accidentally been muted. Can you unmute it? And the little microphone symbol, just uncross it. Joe, you can answer your phone. Joe's microphone has been muted. Please unmute it. Joe, please answer your phone.
Here we go. It's muted. Unmuted. Thanks, Finuala. Now where do I go from here? Finuala, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so we can go ahead as soon as I get my slides back up here. There we go. Right, so we were talking about Cook and what sort of man he was. Is that okay? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, please carry on.
Okay. So on the left here is Professor John Beaglehole's definitive biography of Cook, The Life of Captain James Cook. And it is a masterly work, though by and large it is regarded as a continuation of the long tradition of idealization of Captain Cook. There's no doubt that Beaglehole revered Cook. By contrast, Glyn Williams, in this other book, The Death of Captain Cook, takes a totally different view of Cook. His subtitle is A Hero Made and Unmade. He examines the story of Cook's progress from obscurity to fame and eventually, Williams claims, to infamy. It is a revisionist history. What about the opinion of people who knew Cook? Well, here's the opinion of the surgeon who traveled with him on his third voyage. To quote, he was beloved by his people who looked up to him as a father and obeyed his commands with alacrity. The confidence we placed in him was unremitting. Our admiration of his great talents was unbounded, and our esteem for his good qualities affectionate and sincere. So Cook was not the god which some Polynesians took him to be. He was not the man who could do no wrong, as one of his biographers seems to have thought. He was a man of the hard times in which he lived, who from very humble beginnings rose to fellowship of the Royal Society and to be one of the greatest explorers and navigators of all time. I like what Paul Thoreau said of him. It is impossible to travel in the Pacific and not develop an admiration for this hero of navigation and discovery, who was a thoroughly good man. You will enjoy Tony Horwitz's book, which in Australia is published under a different title, Into the Blue. The book is very entertaining. He has a wonderful light touch, Bill Bryson wrote about his book, "No writer has better captured the heroic enigma that was Captain Cook than Tony Horwitz in this amiable and enthralling excursion around the Pacific." Right, now move forward 75 years, and we now come to Glyn Williams' account of the search for the Northwest Passage, called Arctic Labyrinth. You can see it's got a Goodreads rating of 3.97, so it's on the very edge of excellence. The discovery voyages of the 15th century opened up fabulous new worlds in the East for merchants and adventurers and scholars, but it was very difficult to get to the East. Before the time of the Suez and Panama canals, there were only two routes to the East, and both of them involved long, arduous, and dangerous voyages to the south. So there was a strong need for a route linking the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. And here it is, the Northwest Passage, the maritime philosopher's stone, a route along the northern coast of Canada inside the Arctic Circle. But the geography of the passage is complex, as you can see, and the maps make no mention of ice or cold or darkness or the bitter winds that blow. Even now, it is not easy. As Glyn Williams wrote, no episode in the history of oceanic enterprise offers a greater contrast between anticipation and disillusionment than the centuries-long search for the Northwest Passage. The search eventually lasted for more than 300 years, and it cost many lives and many ships. Undoubtedly, by far the most famous story is the story of Captain Sir John Franklin and his expedition of 1845. So when the British government planned this expedition, Franklin was an obvious candidate for the leadership. He had had a distinguished career, but he was now 59 and he was out of shape, and some people had misgivings. Nevertheless, his experience counted in his favor, and he was chosen to command the expedition. 2 ships were requisitioned, which after modification were state-of-the-art vessels, and the expedition left England in May 1845. The ships were last seen during the last days of July 1845, moored to a distant iceberg. But after that, only the Inuit would ever see the ships and their crews alive again. 2.5 years went by with no word from the Franklin expedition. So by the end of 1847, the authorities were becoming anxious, and they offered rewards. They offered a reward of £20,000, about £1.8 million in today's money, to any party who shall render efficient assistance to the crews of the discovery ships under the command of Sir John Franklin, and £10,000 to any party who shall succeed in ascertaining their fate. And from that time on, clearly the search for the Northwest Passage also became the search for Sir John Franklin and the men of his expedition. In the meantime, the first complete transit of the Northwest Passage was made by Roland Amundsen, of whom we will hear more later, between the years of 1903 and 1906. For more than 160 years, intermittent searches for the fate of Franklin's expedition found very little. And then in 2008, Parks Canada announced a new series of annual searches. And even so, by the late summer of 2014, very little had been found. But 3 months later, in September 2014, after a search which had lasted 166 years, HMS Erebus was found lying 11 meters below the surface of the freezing waters of Queen Maud Gulf in the Canadian Arctic. 2 years and 1 day later, the wreck of HMS Terror was also found on the seabed about 50 kilometers away, remarkably well preserved after 168 years. So the discovery of these wrecks marks the start of a new chapter in the saga of the lost Franklin expedition. Further exploration of the ship's remains may finally provide answers to some long-standing questions, but many questions will never be answered. It is a fascinating and powerful story, and I can strongly recommend Arctic Labyrinth. There are, of course, many other books that have been written about the Northwest Passage, and here are some of them. I'll be very happy to pass on the details afterwards to anybody who would like them. And these are other books written by Glyn Williams, and many of them are terrific books, just on the edge of excellence, according to Goodreads. So the third book on my list is the story of a famous race. The book is now called The Last Place on Earth. It's written by a man by the name of Roland Huntford, and it is, of course, about the race for the South Pole, which took place in the southern summer of 1911-1912, and it was between Norway, represented by Amundsen, who we've already come across, and England, represented by Captain Robert Falcon Scott. And as everybody knows, the race was won by Amundsen. Since then, at least 50 books have been written about the race and the men who took part, but this book is arguably the most important of them, if not the best. It is a revisionist history par excellence. First published in 1979 as Scott and Amundsen, and then reissued in 1985 as The Last Place on Earth. As you can see, it has a very good Goodreads rating of 4.32 and was described by one critic as a tour de force in expedition literature. Alternatively, you can also watch the 7-part TV series, and here is the link at the bottom of the slide. Again, I'll be very happy to pass it on to you after the lecture. Huntford's book caused an uproar in Antarctic circles in England and even amongst the general public. Somebody called it a devastating demolition job. Scott bad, Amundsen good. The New York Times said one of the great debunking biographies. Until this book was published, Scott's last expedition was widely regarded in England as a glorious failure, and Scott himself as a tragic hero. Amundsen, on the other hand, was regarded in England as the somewhat devious Scandinavian who had stolen the South Pole from the man who truly deserved it. Then in 1979, along came Huntford's book, which caused an uproar because it put forward an alternative point of view that Amundsen deserved his success because his planning was far superior to Scott's, whereas errors of judgment by Scott ultimately resulted in the death of Scott himself and his companions, the victims of their own incompetence. The two men were very different. Scott was a naval officer who had been to Antarctica before, but had relatively little experience of snow and ice. He was a dreamer, and Huntford paints a picture of him as insecure, isolated, vacillating, intolerant of criticism, and unpopular, a man who relied on naval hierarchy to maintain discipline. Amundsen, on the other hand, was a Norwegian with years of experience, in fact, a lifetime of experience in cold climates. He was the first man to traverse the Northwest Passage, and he was a capable seaman, navigator, and skier. He was hard-headed and practical, a shrewd realist, and a man whose expedition was informal and harmonious. And this is a map of these two competing routes to the pole. Scott in green on the left and Amundsen in red on the right. Amundsen averaged 25 kilometers a day, and it took him 54 days to reach the pole. Scott had further to go. He started 11 days after Amundsen, and he averaged only 16 kilometers per day. So it took him 78 days to reach the pole. The result was that he and his companions only reached the pole more than a month after Amundsen, and by that time Amundsen and his colleagues were already back at the coast at the Bay of Whales. Here is a picture of 4 of the 5 members of Amundsen's team at the South Pole, 14 December 1911, all of them in good condition. In contrast, the British Polar Party, more than a month later, exhausted and demoralized. As Scott wrote in his diary before he died, "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." It is remarkable that at least some of Amundsen's men actually gained weight during their journey, and of course there were other factors. There were many factors which contributed to Amundsen's success and to Scott's failure, but it's hard to avoid the conclusion that ultimately Scott's failure was due to his own errors of judgment. And perhaps the greatest of those errors was his decision not to take dogs to the pole. Nansen, Fridtjof Nansen, the doyen of polar travel in those days, excuse me, advised Scott to take dogs, and more dogs, but Scott was reluctant. As he himself wrote, "One cannot calmly contemplate the murder of animals which possess such individuality and which very possibly one has learned to regard as friends and companions." Amundsen, by contrast, had a completely utilitarian approach. He thought it was cruel to drive dogs till they died from exhaustion. So instead, he worked them less hard, he fed them better, and then at calculated intervals, he shot the weakest and fed them to the strongest. Scott decided on a mixture of different forms of transport, including ponies, some dogs, and man-hauling. There's a picture of ponies on board Terra Nova en route to Antarctica, but they proved to be of very limited value because their sweat just froze and their hooves simply sank into the snow. Finally, Scott's men had to man-haul. I've done some man-hauling myself, and I can tell you that it is brutally hard work. So Huntford's book is well written and fascinating, but it is an uncomfortable revisionist history, especially for people who have admired Scott. I can highly recommend it, and of course there are many other books on the same topic. So the next book is also set in Antarctica, this time called Alone on the Ice, written by a man called David Roberts, who we'll come across in a moment. It is the story of another expedition to Antarctica at almost the same time, Sir Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition, 1911 to 1914. And it's also the story of Mawson's survival, which Sir Edmund Hillary called the greatest survival story in the history of exploration. The book is written by David Roberts, who is a former president of the Harvard Mountaineering Club and is often acknowledged as the Dean of American climbing literature. This is a picture of Mawson. He had been a member of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition in 1907, and he'd been one of the party who were the first to attain the South Magnetic Pole and also to climb the highest volcano in Antarctica, Mount Erebus. He was the principal instigator of this expedition, and he was its leader. And unfortunately, he and his achievements were somewhat cast into the shade or overshadowed by Scott's Terra Nova expedition, which took place at more or less the same time, and subsequently also by Shackleton's legendary Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. But the AAE was almost as dramatic as either of the other two. Here's a map of Antarctica. Here's a Sanai base almost on the Greenwich Meridian. Here's Casey, where I spent the year 1976. Up here is Mawson, a base named after Sir Douglas. And this down here is Cape Denison, which is where Mawson's men built their base. When they arrived at the coastline of East Antarctica, they had to find a place to build a base. Cape Denison looked ideal. The only problem was they had arrived at the windiest place on Earth on a rare calm day. This place experiences fierce katabatic winds which regularly exceed 200 kilometers per hour. The average annual wind speed is 80 kilometers per hour. And Sir Douglas Mawson called his book about the expedition The Home of the Blizzard. For 9 months of the year, an almost continuous blizzard rages, and for weeks one can only crawl about outside the shelter of the hut, unable to see an arm's length owing to the blinding snowdrift. So Mawson's plan was to explore the coast both east and west of Cape Denison. He himself led the Far Eastern Party, as he called it, which headed east with 17 dogs at the beginning of November 1912. He took with him a man by the name of Xavier Mertz, a Swiss explorer and mountaineer and skier who was 31 at the time, and a young chap by the name of Belgrave Ninnis, who was an officer in the Royal Fusiliers in England, who was 25. All went well for about a month, but then 480 kilometers from Cape Denison, Belgrave Ninnis, 6 dogs, and a sledge laden with important gear fell through the lid of a crevasse and were never seen again. Clearly, Mawson and Mertz could go no further east. They turned westward for what they knew would be a desperate struggle to get home. 2 weeks later, they killed the last of their 17 dogs, and 2 days after that, Mertz fell ill. He deteriorated rapidly, and 9 days later, he was dead. It is thought by some that he died of vitamin A poisoning from eating husky dogs' livers. Mawson, for his part, then cut their sledge in half, and he continued the battle alone. Miraculously, he survived a fall into a crevasse on the Mertz Glacier, and 46 days after the death of Ninnis, he found a cache of food left by men who had been sent out to look for them. He arrived back at Cape Denison just in time to see the expedition ship Aurora disappearing over the horizon on her way back to Australia. Fortunately, some men had remained behind in the hope that Mawson had survived. They all had to spend an extra year in Antarctica. Mawson made a good recovery and had a very distinguished career. For many years, I thought that that was the end of the matter, but now along comes another revisionist biography, this time by a man by the name of David Day. I have not yet read the book, but he makes a number of allegations about Mawson, which I found extremely unlikely. Was Mawson what Day claims? I very much doubt it. Biographers have their own hidden agendas, not least the desire to increase their sales. And I found it strange that when I visited Day's homepage on the web, I could find no mention of flaws in the ice. I'm sorry that we don't have time to go into all these allegations, and clearly I now have to read the book. David Roberts has written many books about climbing and about Antarctica. Here are some of them. I strongly recommend Alone on the Ice. It is riveting reading, and it eventually brings out the amazing story of Mawson's survival. Now, the next book is much closer to home. It's a book about Mount Kenya. It's called No Picnic on Mount Kenya, and it's written by an Italian by the name of Felice Benuzzi and translated from the Italian. And it's the extraordinary story of 3 Italian prisoners of war who escaped from a prisoner of war camp near Mount Kenya and set off to try to climb it. And despite being written in Italian many years ago, it still has a Goodreads rating of 4.3, which is excellent. So Mount Kenya, as I'm sure most of you know, is an extinct volcano on the equator. Although on the equator it is to some extent snow-covered. It was first climbed by the Mackinda expedition of 1899, which consisted of 6 Europeans, 66 Swahilis, 2 Maasai guides, and 96 Kikuyu porters. Mackinda, later Sir Halford Mackinda, took it upon himself to name the twin peaks of the mountain, but I give him great credit for choosing local and not colonial names. He named the highest peak on the left after Batian, the chief medicine man of the Maasai, and the other peak after Nelian, his brother. This is Felice Benuzzi, the author of the book. During World War II, he and other Italians were captured by Allied forces in Italian-occupied Abyssinia and imprisoned at Nanyuki. And as it happened, the Nanyuki camp faced Mount Kenya, and Benuzzi had done some climbing in the Alps and the Dolomites, and he found himself staring longingly at Mount Kenya, at the mountain world, from the smallness of his own world in a prisoner of war camp. The tedium of camp life was hard to bear, and he felt that somehow he simply had to climb the mountain. This is more or less the view that they had of the northwest face of Mount Kenya. He and 2 other prisoners spent 8 months clandestinely preparing. They made ice climbing gear from barbed wire. They began hoarding food. They had no map of Mount Kenya, so instead they took along a sketch of it on the label of an OXO tin. Benuzzi got a mechanic friend to forge a copy of the gate key, so they used to sneak out at night and bury their food supplies and equipment. And eventually, on the day they planned, they escaped from a prison working party by hiding in the ditches on the side of the road. Unfortunately, their technical equipment was inadequate, and Nelian and Batian were beyond their reach, but they did manage to climb Point Lenana, the 3rd highest peak on the mountain. After 18 days on the mountain, they came back down. They broke back into their camp and gave themselves up to the British commandant. He sentenced them to 28 days of solitary confinement, but later reduced the sentence to 7 days because he admired their sportsmanship. And then they picked up their lives as prisoners again. So it's a charming book. The mountain has changed greatly since Benuzzi's famous escape. Here is the southwest face as it used to look after good snowfall. In the middle at the bottom you can see the Darwin Glacier, and then leading upwards the beautiful Diamond Couloir, once famous as one of the world's best ice climbing routes. Now, for practical purposes, the route is non-existent. This is what the mountain looks more like today in so-called normal times. As it happens, the Lewis Glacier, which is one of the glaciers that you have to cross to get to the start of the climbing route, happens to be one of the most thoroughly surveyed tropical glaciers in the world. And measurements have been made ever since 1934, and they have shown a drastic and progressive shrinking in the size of the glacier. At this stage, the glacier has decreased in volume by 90% since the first measurements were made in 1934. And this is the glacier. In the line of flames here illustrates the glacial edge in 1934 compared to where it is now. Another of the earliest ascents of Mount Kenya was made by two legendary climbers of the years between the world wars, Bill Tillman and Eric Shipton. Tillman had not always been a great climber. On a previous attempt to climb Kilimanjaro, he said he suffered from an excessive willingness to sit down. But this is what he wrote after climbing Mount Kenya. On Kenya is to be found climbing at its best. Few other countries that, having no climbing traditions, have in their stead such a symbol and an inspiration. So this is his book about climbs in East Africa, called Snow on the Equator. It's got an extremely high Goodreads rating. So it's a charming story and very well worth reading, and appears to be easily available. The next book is also about climbing. It's called Annapurna, and it was originally written in French, translated into English. Annapurna is the 10th highest mountain in the world. It was the first 8,000-meter peak to be climbed by Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenal in 1950, and it's the only one which was climbed on the first attempt. It is also the most dangerous of the 8,000-meter peaks, with a fatality rate of 32 per 100 successful ascents. For every 100 successful attempts, 32 climbers will die. Herzog was the leader of the expedition. He and Lachenal were the only two climbers to reach the summit, but they paid a terrible price for their success. Both of them lost their gloves on the descent, both of them became badly frostbitten, and both of them had to be carried off the mountain. Herzog eventually lost all his fingers and all his toes. Here he is receiving treatment on the way back to France. Lachenal, for his part, lost all his toes and parts of his feet. And here he is arriving back in France, where he had to learn to walk and ski all over again. Lachenal sadly died in 1955 in a skiing accident. Whether the fact that he had no toes contributed to his death is not certain. Herzog, by contrast, became a national hero in France. He became the mayor of Chamonix. He was the Minister of Sport in the French government, and he was a member of the International Olympic Committee for many years. And at least in part, his fame was due to the book that he wrote about the expedition afterwards. It is simply called Annapurna, and it is said to be the most famous and best-selling mountaineering book of all time, but that is perhaps only in Francophone countries. So it is hardly little known in English-speaking countries, and it is a classic, so I have included it. But behind the scenes, all was not well. In 1950, before the expedition even left France, Herzog had made all the climbers sign an undertaking which prevented them from writing anything about the expedition. This worked to Herzog's advantage for the first few years after the climb, but he could not, of course, impose the same conditions on the families or friends of the climbers after they had died. And in 1996, when Herzog was still alive, aged 77, the unexpurgated diaries of Louis Lachenal were published, as well as a biography of one of the climbers. These gave fresh perspectives and told a much more complex tale of a great enterprise whose image was exploited for political and personal interests. Herzog was seen in an altogether less flattering light, and in particular it became clear that he had failed to give credit to Lachenal, who very reluctantly had accompanied him to the summit and paid the price by losing all his toes. Finally, in 2013, after Herzog had died, David Roberts published a revisionist history of the expedition called True Summit, in which he used previously unpublished sources to show that there had indeed been major descent during the expedition. Even Herzog's daughter was critical of her father. She portrayed him as a megalomaniac who, quote, rewrote history, betrayed and neglected his entourage without ever having the sense of hurting anybody because society judged him to be so good. So the story of the first ascent of Annapurna is yet another story of ambitious men with nerves of steel, but to some extent feet of clay. But often they wrote wonderfully well about climbing and about what they call the brotherhood of the rope. Here is what Herzog wrote on the last page of Annapurna. Annapurna, to which we had gone empty-handed, was a treasure on which we should live the rest of our lives. With this realization, we turn the page. A new life begins. There are other Annapurnas in the lives of men. So, the next book is about the sea. It's called A Voyage for Madmen. It's written by Peter Nichols, and it is the story of the 1968 Golden Globe single-handed, non-stop, round-the-world yacht race. Sebastian Junger, author of A Perfect Storm, called it one of the most gripping sea stories I have ever read. It has a Goodreads rating of 4.29, clearly excellent. Peter Nichols is well qualified to write the book. He has crossed the Atlantic alone in a wooden boat himself, a journey which he described in this book, Sea Change. And he's also written a biography of Robert Fitzroy, the captain of Darwin's ship Beagle, both of them highly regarded. The first man to sail single-handed around the world was, of course, Joshua Slocum in the year 1895 to 1898. And his delightful book about the voyage, Sailing Alone Around the World, is still in print 120 years after it was first published. And amazingly, it has a Goodreads rating of 4.14. But Slocum stopped, of course, many times in the course of his voyage. Fast forward 70 years, and along came Francis Chichester, who in 1966 completed a very fast solo circumnavigation, 226 days at sea, with only a single stop in Sydney, Australia. Why anybody would choose to stop in Sydney, Australia, rather than Cape Town, South Africa, is, however, not easy to understand. Chichester's voyage inspired the idea of a single-handed race around the world, non-stop and without any assistance of any kind, using the classic sailing ship route eastabout around the world. There were 9 entries for the race, and this is what happened to them. Only one man finished the race. Another retired out of boredom. He got tired of racing, turned east and sailed on to Tahiti. 5 men retired because of technical problems of various kinds. 1 was rescued after his boat broke up and sank, and 1 almost certainly committed suicide. The man who finished the race was a merchant navy officer by the name of Robin Knox Johnston, now Sir Robin, in his boat named Suhaili, an Islamic word meaning companion. She's a beautiful little boat, 9 meters long, built of teak in India in the early 1960s. The journey took Knox Johnston 312 days. He wrote about it in his own book, A World of My Own, which has an excellent Goodreads rating of 4.34. As it happened, there's also a South African connection. For some time, before the race, he had been a deck officer in ships trading up and down the South African coast. and he actually wrote a maritime history of the Cape of Good Hope. So he's a multifaceted man. He sailed from Falmouth in 1968, and he arrived back in Falmouth 312 days later in good order. And not surprisingly, he became a legend in sailing circles around the world. The first people to board Suhaili after the finish were the customs officers from Falmouth. As they jumped across onto his boat, the senior officer, trying to keep a straight face, asked the time-honored question, "Where from?" And Robin Knox Johnson replied, "Falmouth."